Hades 2 recently released in early access, and many of you have asked me to do a video on the music, but I never played the original Hades, so I started playing it a couple weeks ago. And you guys weren't lying, the music is pretty great. There's some wacky time signatures, catchy metal riffs, and some interesting tonalities. In this video, I kind of want to take a look at that last part, because the music of Hades uses a rather unique scale that I feel like I'll otherwise never get to talk about. That is, of course, if I can actually get around to transcribing the tunes, because the romantic subplot with Thanatos got me locked in like a Subway Surfers video. So let's just hop right into it, starting with the main theme. The Hades theme plays in a few places in the game, sometimes remixed or used as a leitmotif. Let's hear the version that plays on the title screen. Pretty fun tune with a vaguely Mediterranean kind of tonality. And of course a recognizable leitmotif with those 4 notes. We're rather inarguably in the key of C something or other, starting and ending the phrase on C in the melody, bass, and harmony. Let's construct a scale using the notes in the melody. We have C, D flat, E flat, E, F, G, A flat, and B flat. On first glance at the tune, it definitely has characteristics of more popular scales, like the classic double harmonic major, altered, Phrygian dominant, or just simple Phrygian. But none of these are quite the same as the Hades scale. Double harmonic major and Phrygian dominant have that characteristic C, D flat, E movement, but lack the E flat. Phrygian, on the other hand, has the opposite problem, E flat but no E. The altered scale, or the cooler name Superlocrian, has almost everything but contains that sharp 4 and lacks the natural 4 and 5, which would be F and G in this case. You may have already noticed, but this Hades scale isn't like any of these for a simpler reason. It's octatonic, meaning 8 notes, while most commonly used scales are heptatonic with 7. So let's take a look at the most commonly used octatonic scales, the 2 diminished scales. Whole half diminished, as the name would imply, alternates whole and half steps, so C whole half diminished would be this. Not very close at all, so let's take a look at the other one, half whole diminished, where we alternate half and whole steps. This is definitely much closer. The first 4 notes are perfect, and it contains the G and B flat. But like the altered scale, it has this erroneous F sharp instead of F, and we also have this A instead of A flat. So honestly, I'm not sure the Hades scale has a name, or at least one that isn't obfuscatory or needlessly long. If you're set theory's strongest believer, then it's technically set 826. But I think set theory sucks, and in this case tells us nothing about the scale in question. Berkeley would call this scale Mixolydian flat 9 sharp 9 flat 13, but I think it implies a little bit too much harmonic function and is also just a mouthful. I couldn't really find a clean name for this scale, so per this guy's suggestion in the 8-Bit Music Theory Discord, I'll just call it Steve.
Steve.
So if we're considering Steve to be a scale in the first place, it breaks quite a few conventions. Almost all commonly observed heptatonic scales alternate whole and half steps, avoiding 2 contiguous half steps. This generally leads to melodies in those scales having kinder movement, avoiding the crunchier or otherwise circus-like sound of the chromatic scale, which is just entirely half steps. But with octatonic scales, the way the math works, the only 2 permutations that avoid 2 contiguous half steps are the 2 aforementioned diminished scales, which alternate wholes and halves. What this means is that any other octatonic scale is guaranteed to have at least 2 contiguous half steps, such as with Steve. The E flat forms a half step with the E, which forms a half step with the F. But the Hades theme avoids that chromatic kind of sound because while both E-flat and E are prominent in the melody, they never touch. Which is also the basis of another important question: is this tune more major or minor? Almost all common heptatonic scales can be categorized into either major or minor by looking at the tonic triad, or root third and fifth of the scale. The aforementioned Phrygian from earlier would be considered a minor mode, while double harmonic major is perhaps expectedly major. The other notes in this scale serve to brighten or darken the color, but the tonic triad don't lie. Exceptions to this major-minor rule are things like Locrian, because the tonic triad forms a diminished chord, which is neither major nor minor. The diminished scales are also exceptions, not even necessarily because they're octatonic, but because they're similarly structured around diminished triads. So let's try applying this to Steve. We have the root, which is C, then skip a note for the third, which is E-flat, then skip the E, and then we have F. Well, this isn't a triad. I suppose the bizarre construction of this scale means this rule doesn't really apply. So let's look at the tune more holistically. The only chords throughout are the ambiguous C power chord, which is just root and fifth, this A-flat major chord, C minor, and finally C major. I would argue that with the melody notes and with that A-flat major chord derived from the C minor scale, this tune is probably intuitively felt as minor-ish, but with a lot of sprinklings of major flavor. That main four-note motif, though it does hit both the E-flat and E, has that final E-C movement, which forms the basis of the major triad. You could honestly say that both the E-flat and E are interchangeable scale tones, and the music is a sort of modal mixture between the two resulting heptatonic scales, that being Phrygian and Phrygian dominant. It's definitely a cleaner explanation compared to just Steve. But I think something as rigid as two scales doesn't really do this justice. The sound is just so baked into the soundtrack, and other tunes take this concept even further by introducing more notes into the tonality. Take a listen to this snippet from Out of Tartarus, for instance. This first bit sounds mostly minor but has a flat 5, and if you add the implied flat 2, which appears anyways later, it's technically Locrian, which is pretty exciting. But in the second variation of this riff, we kinda just go back to Steve. The flat 5 is replaced by the natural 5 again, and the natural 3 is back. This one part in the Bloodless similarly plays around with the tonality. This opening riff is pretty simple. The top voice outlines the first 3 notes of Steve, with the A, B flat, and C. But what I think is really cool is the bottom voice, which mutually exclusively outlines the following 3 notes of the scale with C sharp, D, and E. The way it lines up, it creates this cool effect that's rather unnoticeable. We start the groove in a more A major, but the last bit with the C puts this in a more A minor, or I suppose A Phrygian. But it doesn't feel like we're moving between 2 block chords of A major and A minor. We're really just washing between these major-ish sounds and these darker minor modes to just create a cool color. There isn't strong harmonic movement in the tune that drives these notes, and the notes aren't used as passing tones for the actual diatonic notes, it's really just flavor. This concept isn't new, of course. Berkeley likes to talk about the concept of composite minor, essentially this ambiguous minor space that sits somewhere between natural minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor, Dorian, and the blues and such. The point is that you can draw from any of these slightly different tonalities in the melody or harmony, and it works because it's all glued together by that tonic minor triad. Greensleeves is a wonderful example of basic composite minor, where we interchangeably use the kinder flat 7 and more tensiony natural 7. But I think this concept can be taken even further. I would argue that Hades works in this sort of composite Phrygian, for lack of a better name, where we have our minor triad, flat 2, and characteristics of other minor modes in the soundtrack, and even that major third of Phrygian dominant just for the heck of it. What's cool is that composite Phrygian is essentially just a mode or permutation of composite minor. If we simplify composite minor into this, where we have both the flat 7 of natural minor and natural 7th of harmonic minor, we can start on the 5th scale degree and walk up, and suddenly we have Steve. Composite minor typically doesn't include both 7s in the same vertical slice, and just uses one or the other depending on what amount of tension is needed in the melody. Likewise, the minor third of Steve is sometimes used melodically to mitigate the large jump between the flat 2, while the major third, of course, creates that jump, but also is frequently used in that spicy tonic major chord, as we heard in the Bloodless. And if we think about it like that, it's definitely pretty common, especially in styles that like to hang out in Phrygian dominant land, like flamenco for instance. But I think this works really well for the idiosyncratic sound of Hades. Composer Darren Korb himself described the sound as specifically Mediterranean prog rock Halloween music, which is strangely really fitting. Even the instrument choices notwithstanding, the music combines the darker, spooky minor modes with that Phrygian dominant sound that is prevalent in the real-life Mediterranean region. And I think that's pretty cool. I'll do a Hades 2 video eventually because I hear there's some cool time-sick stuff, but I kind of want to wait until it's out of early access, and my backlog already has way too many games. Wait, what's that doing there?